Hello, everyone. Welcome back to your favorite podcast, Imaginary Lines. This is episode 10. I am Keith Giles. I'm joined by my good friend Darrell Epp, who's a really great poet, by the way. And if you haven't checked out his poetry, I really recommend it, especially his newest one, Mechanical Monkeys, which is available on Amazon. They're all on Amazon,
Yes.
but check those out. Today, we decided to introduce a brand new, hopefully recurring segment called Story Time. Story time. So in story time, you would explain how is story time going to work, Darrell? What are we doing?
Basically, Keith and I like stories.
Yes.
So what's going to happen? We're going to read a story and then talk about how awesome it is.
Okay.
And I'm sure the viewers at home will be able to get the hang of it.
Yes. So if you're listening, find yourself a comfy seat. Maybe get yourself a nice hot beverage or something, and shut out your distractions. Close your eyes, and let Darrell read you a story. So, what story are you going to read for us today?
I'm going to read a story by Anton Chekov called Rothschild's Fiddle. And on a previous episode, I read Reunion by John Cheever. And you'll notice the thing these two stories have in common is I think they're awesome.
Okay.
So if I think it's awesome, it gets to go on the podcast.
All right.
And so when I read the story, just make notes about things that strike you, what makes it so awesome. And when it's over, we'll dig a bit more deeper into taking it apart and seeing what makes it run.
All right. We'll look under the hood. All right. Sounds good. All right. Kick us off.
This is a story by Anton Chekov called Rothschild's Fiddle. The town was a little one, worse than a village, and it was inhabited by scarcely any but old people who died with an infrequency that was really annoying. In the hospital and in the prison fortress, very few coffins were needed. In fact, business was bad. If Yakov Ivanov had been an undertaker in the chief town of the province, he would certainly have had a house of his own, and people would have addressed him as Yakov Matreyevich. Here, in this wretched little town, people called him simply Yakov. His nickname in the street was for some reason Bronze, and he lived in a poor way, like a humble peasant, in a little old hut in which there was only one room. And in this room, he and Marfa, the stove, a double bed, the coffins, his bench, and all their belongings were crowded together. Yakov made good, solid coffins. For peasants and working people, he made them to fit himself. And this was never unsuccessful, for there were none taller and stronger than he, even in the prison, though he was 70. For gentry and for women, he made them to measure, and used an iron ruler for the purpose. He was very unwilling to take orders for children's coffins, and made them straight off, without measurements, contemptuously. And when he was paid for the work, he always said, I must confess, I don't like trumpery jobs. Apart from his trade, playing the fiddle brought him in a small income. The Jews' orchestra, conducted by Moise Ilyich Shakez, the tinsmith, who took more than half their receipts for himself, played as a rule at weddings in the town. As Yakov played very well on the fiddle, especially Russian songs, Shakez sometimes invited him to join the orchestra at a fee of half a ruble a day, in addition to tips from the visitors. When Bronze sat in the orchestra, first of all, his face became crimson and perspiring. It was hot. There was a suffocating smell of garlic. The fiddle squeaked. The double bass wheezed close to his right ear, while the flute wailed at his left, played by a gaunt, red-haired Jew who had a perfect network of red and blue veins all over his face, and who bore the name of the famous millionaire Rothschild. And this accursed Jew contrived to play even the liveliest things plaintively. For no apparent reason, Yakov little by little became possessed by hatred and contempt for the Jews, especially for Rothschild. He began to pick quarrels with him, rail at him in unseemly language, and once even tried to strike him. And Rothschild was offended and said, looking at him ferociously, "If it were not that I respect you for your talent, I would have sent you flying out the window." Then he began to cry, and because of this, Yakov was not often asked to play in the orchestra. He was only sent for in case of extreme necessity, in the absence of one of the Jews. Yakov was never in a good mood, as he was continually having to put up with terrible losses. For instance, it was a sin to work on Sundays or saints' days, and Monday was an unlucky day, so that in the course of the year, there were some 200 days on which, whether he liked it or not, he had to sit with his hands folded. And only think what a loss that meant. If anyone in the town had a wedding without music, or if Shakas did not send for Yakov, that was a loss too. The superintendent of the prison was ill for 2 years and was wasting away, and Yakov was impatiently waiting for him to die. But the superintendent went away to the chief town of the province to be doctored, and there took and died. There's a loss for you, 10 rubles at least, as there would have been an expensive coffin to make, lined with brocade. The thought of his losses haunted Yakov, especially at night. He laid his fiddle on the bed beside him, and when all sorts of nonsensical ideas came into his mind, he touched a string. The fiddle gave out a sound in the darkness, and he felt better. On the 6th of May of the previous year, Marfa had suddenly taken ill. The old woman's breathing was labored. She drank a great deal of water, and she staggered as she walked. Yet she lighted the stove in the morning and even went herself to get water. Towards evening, she lay down. Yakov played his fiddle all day. When it was quite dark, he took the book in which he used every day to put down his losses, and, feeling dull, he began adding up the total for the year. It came to more than 1,000 rubles. This so agitated him that he flung the reckoning beads down and trampled them under his feet. Then he picked up the reckoning beads and again spent a long time clicking with them and heaving deep, strained sighs. His face was crimson and wet with perspiration. He thought that if he had put that lost 1,000 rubles in the bank, the interest for a year would have been at least 40 rubles. So that 40 rubles was a loss too. In fact, wherever one turned, there were losses and nothing else. "Yakov," Marfa called unexpectedly, "I am dying." He looked round at his wife. Her face was rosy with fever, unusually bright and joyful looking. Bronze, accustomed to seeing her face always pale, timid, and unhappy looking, was bewildered. It looked as if she really were dying, and were glad that she was going away forever from that hut, from the coffins, and from Yakov. And she gazed at the ceiling and moved her lips, and her expression was one of happiness, as though she saw death as her deliverer, and were whispering with him. It was daybreak. From the windows, one could see the flush of dawn. Looking at the old woman, Yakov for some reason reflected that he had not once in his life been affectionate to her. He had no feeling for her, had never once thought to buy her a kerchief or to bring her home some dainty from a wedding, but had done nothing but shout at her, scold her for his losses, shake his fist at her. It is true he had never actually beaten her, but he had frightened her, and at times she had actually been numb with terror. He had forbidden her to drink tea because they spent too much without that, and she drank only hot water. And he understood why she had such a strange, joyful face now, and he was overcome with dread. As soon as it was morning, he borrowed a horse from a neighbor and took Marfa to the hospital. There were not many patients there, and so he had not long to wait, only 3 hours. To his great satisfaction, the patients were not being received by the doctor, who was himself ill, but by the assistant, Maxim Nikolaitch, an old man of whom everyone in the town used to say, though he drank and was quarrelsome, he knew more than the doctor. "I wish you good day," said Yakov, leading his old woman into the consulting room. "You must excuse us, Maxim Nikolaitch. We are always troubling you with our affairs. Here you see my better half is ailing, the partner of my life, as they say, excuse the expression." Knitting his grizzled brows and stroking his whiskers, the assistant began to examine the old woman, and she sat on a stool, a wasted, bent figure with a sharp nose and open mouth, looking like a bird that wants to drink. The assistant said slowly, and he heaved a sigh. "Influenza, possibly fever. There's typhus in the town now. Well, the old woman has lived her life, thank God. How old is she?" "She'll be 70 in another year, Maxim Nikolaitch." "Well, the old woman has lived her life. It's time to say goodbye." "You are quite right in what you say, of course, Maxim Nikolaitch," said Yakov, smiling from politeness. "And we thank you feelingly for your kindness. But allow me to say, every insect wants to live." "To be sure," said the assistant, in a tone which suggested that it depended upon him whether the woman lived or died. "Well then, my good man, put a cold compress on her head and give her these powders twice a day. And so goodbye. Bonjour." From the expression of his face, Yakov saw that it was a bad case, and that no sorts of powders would be any help. It was clear to him that Marfa would die very soon, if not today, tomorrow. He nudged the assistant's elbow, winked at him, and said in a low voice, "If you would just cup her, Maxim Nikolaitch," which means bloodletting, which was all they had back then. I have no time, my good fellow. Take your old woman and go in God's name. Goodbye." "Be so gracious," Yakov besought him. "You know yourself that if, let us say, it were her stomach or inside that were bad, then powders or drops. But you see, she has got a chill. In a chill, the first thing is to let blood, Maxim Nikolaitch." But the assistant had already sent for the next patient, and a peasant woman came into the consulting room with a boy. Go along," he said to Yakov, frowning. "It's no use to. In that case, put on leeches anyway. Make us pray for you forever." The assistant flew into a rage and shouted, "You speak to me again? You blockhead!" Yakov flew into a rage too and turned crimson all over, but he did not utter a word. He took Marfa on his arm and led her out of the room. Only when they were sitting in the cart, he looked morosely and ironically at the hospital and said, "A nice set of artists they have settled here. No fear, but they would have cupped a rich man, but even a leech he begrudges to the poor, the Herods." When they got home and went into the hut, Marfa stood for 10 minutes holding on to the stove. It seemed to her that if she were to lie down, Yakov would talk to her about his losses and scold her for lying down and not wanting to work. Yakov looked at her drearily and thought that tomorrow was St. John the Divine's, the next day St. Nicolay the Wonder Workers, and the day after that was Saturday, and then Monday, the unlucky day. For 4 days, he would not be able to work, and most likely Marfa would die on one of those days, so he would have to make the coffin today. He picked up his iron ruler, went up to the old woman, and took her measurements. Then he lay down and he crossed himself and began making the coffin. When the coffin was finished, Bronze put on his spectacles and wrote in his book, Marfa Ivanov's coffin, 2 rubles 40 kopecks. And he heaved a sigh. The old woman lay all the time silent with her eyes closed. But in the evening, when it got dark, she suddenly called to the old man. Do you remember, Yakov? He said, looking at him joyfully. Do you remember 50 years ago, God gave us a little baby with flaxen hair? We used always to be sitting by the river then, singing songs under the willows. And laughing bitterly, she added, the baby girl died. Yakov racked his memory, but he could not remember the baby or the willows. It's your fancy, he said. The priest arrived. He administered the sacrament and extreme unction. Then Marfa began muttering something unintelligible, and towards morning she died. Old women, neighbors, washed her, dressed her, and laid her in the coffin. To avoid paying the sacristan, Yakov read the Psalms over the body himself, and they got nothing out of him for the grave, as the gravedigger was a friend of his. 4 peasants carried the coffin to the graveyard, not from money, but from respect. The coffin was followed by old women, beggars, and a couple of crazy saints, and the people who met it crossed themselves piously. And Yakov was very much pleased that it was so creditable, so decorous, and so cheap, and no offense to anyone. As he took his last leave of Marfa, he touched the coffin and thought, a good piece of work. But as he was going back from the cemetery, he was overcome by acute depression. He didn't feel quite well. His breathing was labored and feverish. His legs felt weak and yet a craving for drink. And thoughts of all sorts forced themselves on his mind. He remembered that all his life he had never felt for Marfa, had never been affectionate to her. The 52 years they had lived in the same hut had dragged on a long, long time. But it had somehow happened that in all that time, he had never once thought of her, had paid no attention to her, as though she had been a cat or a dog. And yet every day she had lighted the stove, had cooked and baked, had gone for the water, had chopped the wood, had slept with him in the same bed. And when he came home drunk from the weddings, always reverently hung his fiddle on the wall and put him to bed, and all this in silence, with a timid, anxious expression. Rothschild, smiling and bowing, came to meet Yakov. I was looking for you, uncle, he said. Moisey Ilyich sends you his greetings and bids you come to him at once. Yakov felt in no mood for this. He wanted to cry. Leave me alone, he said, and walked on. How can you? Rothschild said, fluttered, running on in front. Moisey Ilyich will be offended. He bids you come at once. Yakov was revolted at the Jews gasping for breath and blinking, and having so many red freckles on his face. It was disgusting to look at his green coat with black patches on it, and all his fragile, refined figure. Why are you pestering me, garlic? Shouted Yakov. Don't persist. The Jew got angry and shouted, not so noisy, please, or I'll send you flying over the fence. Get out of my sight, roared Yakov, and rushed at him with his fist. One can't live with you scabby Jews. Rothschild, half dead with terror, crouched down and waved his hands over his head, as though to ward off a blow. Then he leapt up and ran away as fast as his legs could carry him. As he ran, he gave little skips and kept clasping his hands, and Yakov could see how his long, thin spine wriggled. Some boys, delighted at the incident, ran after him, shouting, "Jew! Jew!" Some dogs joined in the chase, barking. Someone burst into a roar of laughter, then gave a whistle. The dogs barked with even more noise and unanimity. Then a dog must have bitten Rothschild, as a desperate, sickly scream was heard. Yakov went for a walk on the grazing ground, then wandered on at random in the outskirts of the town, while the street boys shouted, "Here's bronze! Here's bronze!" He came to the river, where the curlews floated in the air, uttering shrill cries, and the ducks quacked. The sun was blazing hot, and there was a glimmer from the water, so that it hurt the eyes to look at it. Yakov walked by a path along the bank and saw a plump, rosy-cheeked lady coming out of the bathing shed, and thought about her, "Ugh, you fat otter." Not far from the bathing sheds, boys were catching crayfish with bits of meat. Seeing him, they began shouting spitefully, "Bronze, bronze." And then he saw an old spreading willow tree with a big hollow in it and a crow's nest on it. And suddenly there rose up vividly in Yakov's memory a baby with flaxen hair and the willow tree Marfa had spoken of. Why, that was it. The same willow tree, green, still, and sorrowful. How old it had grown, poor thing. He sat under it and began to recall the past. On the other bank, where now there was the water meadow, in those days there stood a big birch wood, and yonder on the bare hillside there could be seen on the horizon an old, old pine forest. Big boats used to sail on the river, but now it was all smooth and unruffled. And on the other bank there stood now only one birch tree, youthful and slender like a young lady, and there was nothing on the river but ducks and geese. And it didn't look as if there had ever been boats on it. It seemed as though even the geese were fewer than of old. Yakov shut his eyes, and in his imagination, huge flocks of wild geese soared, meeting one another in the air. He wondered how it had happened that for the last 40 or 50 years of his life, he had never once been to the river, or if he had been by it, he had not paid attention to it. Why, it was a decent-sized river. He might have gone in for fishing and sold the fish to merchants, officials, and the barkeeper at the station, and then have put money in the bank. He might have sailed in a boat from one house to another, playing the fiddle, and people of all classes would have paid to hear him. He might have tried getting big boats afloat again. That would be better than making coffins. He might have bred geese, killed them, and sent them in the winter to Moscow. Why, the feathers alone would very likely mount up to 10 rubles in the year. But he had wasted his time. He had done nothing of this. What losses! Ah, what losses! And if he had gone in for all of these things at once, catching fish, playing the fiddle, running boats, and killing geese, what a fortune he would have made. But nothing of this had happened, even in his dreams. Life had passed uselessly, without any pleasure, had been wasted for nothing, not even a pinch of snuff. There was nothing left in front, and if one looked behind, there was nothing back there but losses. Such terrible losses, it made one cold all over. And why was it a man could not live so as to avoid these losses and misfortunes? One wondered why they had cut down the birch copse and the pine forest. Why was he walking with no reason on the grazing ground? Why do people always do what isn't needful? Why had Yakov all his life scolded, bellowed, shaken his fists, ill-treated his wife? And one might ask, what necessity was there for him to frighten and insult the Jew that day? Why did people in general hinder each other from living? What losses were due to it? What terrible losses? If it were not for hatred and malice, people would get immense benefit from one another. In the evening and in the night, he had visions of the baby, of the willow, of fish, of slaughtered geese, and Marfa looking in profile like a bird that wants to drink, and the pale, pitiful face of Rothschild, and faces moved down from all sides and muttered of losses. He tossed from side to side and got out of bed 5 times to play the fiddle. In the morning, he got up with an effort and went to the hospital. The same Maxim Nikolaevich told him to put a cold compress on his head and gave him some powders. And from his tone and expression, Yakov realized that it was a bad case and that no powders would be of any use. As he went home afterwards, he reflected that death would be nothing but a benefit. He would not have to eat or drink or pay taxes or offend people. And as a man lies in his grave, not for 1 year, but for hundreds and thousands, if one reckoned it up, the gain would be enormous. A man's life meant loss. Death meant gain. This reflection was, of course, a just one, but yet it was bitter and mortifying. Why was the order of the world so strange that life, which is given to man only once, passes away without benefit? He was not sorry to die, but at home, as soon as he saw his fiddle, it sent a pang to his heart, and he felt sorry. He could not take the fiddle with him to the grave, and now it would be left forlorn. And the same thing would happen to the fiddle as to the birch copse and the pine forest. Everything in this world was wasted and would be wasted. Yakov went out of the hut and sat in the doorway, pressing the fiddle to his chest. Thinking of his wasted, profitless life, he began to play. He did not know what, but it was plaintive and touching, and tears trickled down his cheeks. And the harder he thought, the more mournfully the fiddle wailed. The latch clicked once, and again Rothschild appeared at the gate. He walked across half the yard boldly, but seeing Yakov, he stopped short and seemed to shrink, and probably from terror, began making signs with his hands, as though he wanted to show on his fingers what time it was. "Come along, it's all right," said Yakov in a friendly tone, and he beckoned him to come up. "Come along." Looking at him mistrustfully and apprehensively, Yakov began to advance and stopped 7 feet off. "Be so good as not to beat me," he said, ducking. "Moisey Ilyich has sent me again." "Don't be afraid," he said. "Go to Yakov again and tell him," he said, we can't get on without him. There is a wedding on Wednesday. Mr. Sharpalov is marrying his daughter to a good man, and it will be a grand wedding," added the Jew, screwing up one eye. "I can't come," said Yakov, breathing hard. "I'm ill, brother." And he began playing again, and the tears gushed from his eyes onto the fiddle. Rothschild listened attentively, standing sideways to him and folding his arms on his chest. The scared and perplexed expression on his face, little by little, changed to a look of woe and suffering. He rolled his eyes as though he were experiencing an agonizing ecstasy and articulated, "Ack," and tears slowly ran down his cheeks and trickled onto his greenish coat. and Yakov lay in bed all the rest of the day, grieving. In the evening, when the priest confessing him asked, "Do you remember any special sin you have committed?" Straining his failing memory, he thought again of Martha's unhappy face and the despairing shriek of the Jew when the dog bit him. And he said, hardly audibly, "Give the fiddle to Rothschild." "Very well," answered the priest. And now everyone in the town asked where Rothschild got such a fine fiddle. Did he buy it or did he steal it? Or perhaps it came to him as a pledge. He gave up the flute long ago and now plays nothing but the fiddle. Plaintive sounds flow now from his bow, as came once from his flute. But when he tries to repeat what Yakov played, sitting in the doorway, the effect is something so sad and sorrowful that his audience weeps, and he himself rolls his eyes and articulates, "Ah." And this new air was so much liked in the town that the merchants and officials used to be continually sending for Rothschild and making him play it over and over again, a dozen times.
Wow. Wow, there's a lot there. I made a lot of notes.
Good. Let's get to it.
Well, let me see, where do I begin? I think the thing, I guess the main thing that I couldn't help but notice was something that I've actually noticed in a lot of different people and in myself in some ways too. Like, we have a tendency, whatever it is we look for is what we'll find, right? And so it's sort of like we have a filter that we use to look at the world. And once you are looking at the world through that filter, that's all you can see. So Yakov seems to have this filter where all he can see are losses. I think there's even a line where he says, soon that's all, everything is a loss, right? He even keeps a book of his losses, not of his gains. He's not looking at what he has or what, his blessings. He's looking at all the different ways that he's lost something and what he could have had. Oh, if I'd have done this, I could have made this much money. And then he puts that in the tally of, I lost that money, but you didn't really lose it because you didn't, you know what I mean? You never had it. But because you live your life in such a way that that's all you see, then pretty soon that is all you see. And it prevents you from seeing anything else. Like, for example, we met this lady several years ago who told my wife, Wendy, and I, God has given me this gift and I can, all I see are people's sins. Every time I see someone, I can look right at them and I can see all their sins. And I'm like, wow, this is going to be great. So I just told her, I said, well, look, if you look at me and if you come to me or anybody and what you're looking for is to see my sin, I go, I promise you, you're going to find a lot. I could give you a list to help you out.
Yeah.
There's plenty to see. I said, but what if instead of looking for our sin in one another, what if instead we looked for Christ in one another, right? What if our filter, what we were looking for was the good in the person, or looking for Christ in the other person? Well, guess what? You'll see that too, if that's what you're looking for. And then what we could do is encourage one another. Like, anytime we saw Christ in one another, we could point it out. We go, oh, I just see Christ. I just saw Christ in you. I just saw something good in you. We can encourage that, right? So it really matters what we're looking for. And I guess I couldn't help but think about that with Yakov. And I wrote down all these different things, him keeping a tally of his losses and what he's focusing on over his losses. And he's focused on what he doesn't have, not on what he does have. But then I think there's also another well, let's talk about that a little bit before I move on to something else. That to me is one of the things that stood out about this very bitter character. Yeah, even the thing about like how I think it's one of the first lines, people died in this town with an infrequency that was really annoying.
Yes.
So yes, and then you could also then start noticing, what are the things that it seems that Yakov loves the most? What gives him the most joy? Well, money for one thing, and death, which is really odd, right?
Yeah.
If someone dies, woohoo, payday.
Business. Yeah.
Here we go. So he loves what he has learned to love is money, primarily. That's what he's living for, and death, because that's how he makes his money. But what's also really interesting to me, though, is again, there is still sort of like an option for him. Like, so yes, he primarily makes his living as this undertaker, and so that's how he sort of his focus is on death. But he also plays the fiddle, and he's really good at it, and people love him, and then they, like, we can't play without you, and and so it's sort of like, well, maybe he could have focused on that, on making music, and if that had been his focus, then he would have had a different perspective, right? Because it wouldn't have been focused on death. He would have been focused on making people dance or making people happy, or helping them get their minds off of their sickness or their suffering, or because everyone around him is probably struggling in the same kind of level of economic, hardship as he is, and he could alleviate some of that through his music. But also, it's really, when you look at, so what he loves is money and death because of his perspective. And then what does he hate? Well, he hates old people that won't hurry up and die. And he hates the Jews. Yeah. He hates the Jews, but it seems like his hatred for the Jews primarily begins with him sort of hating the guy sitting next to him in the orchestra, this guy Rothschild, right? He doesn't like the way he smells. He doesn't like he's got these ugly veins on his face, and right. And so it seems like he starts off just hating Rothschild, and then he realizes, I think, well, I hate Rothschild because he's a Jew, and therefore now I hate all Jews. But he just kind of hates Rothschild, but inexplicably. There's like, the guy's done nothing to him. He just decided that he hates this guy. And there's also some really interesting details in the story too, like when he goes to the hospital. Okay, this was an odd little observation. So he goes to the hospital. He says there was hardly anybody there. And I'm wondering if he's saying that because in his sort of pessimism, well, crap, how come there are a bunch of people in this hospital that are sick and ready to die, right? He's sort of disappointed on one level. There just aren't that many people here. But then as he tells you, there were not that many people at the hospital. We didn't have long to wait. We managed to get in after only 3 hours. Like 3 hours? If there was nobody there and you waited 3 hours, I think there were some people there, right? So it's more of his pessimism. Again, it's this filter. He has this filter he looks through, that this is how he perceives the world, through this kind of twisted perspective. So because he's got this twisted perspective, he goes to the hospital waiting room. Now there aren't that many people here, meaning I wish there were more people here. And so, we didn't have to wait very long. It was only 3 hours. It's like, dude, your perception of reality is pretty twisted. Anyway, and then just even like when he goes after Martha dies, and he's kind of wandering around the countryside, and he sits down by the lake and by the river, and at first he almost has a moment of like, you think he's going to get it. You think, wow, he's starting to notice nature and the trees and the ducks and the geese and the clouds and like, the beautiful river. And it's just like, you're thinking, okay, man, he's going to get it. And then then again, it's his filter. He switches right back into, you know what? If I'd have started fishing, I could have made a lot more money. Then I could have bought a boat, and I could have rode around on my fiddle playing, at people's houses and making more money. And let's put that in the losses book. Like there he goes again. He can't break out of this. So really fascinating. And I think the other, if you ask what makes this guy like this, like, well, how did he end up this way? Seems like it's the death of this child. right? That he had when he was very young, he and his wife, to the point that he's blocked it out. He doesn't remember it. But that seems to be the clue that what gave him this filter, this twisted sort of focus and emphasis on death and dying probably began with the death of his child. But anyway, just a really beautiful story.
Yeah. First off, about that lady who said she had the magic power to see her secret sins. What happened to mind your own business? I thought that was like an American virtue, like mind your own business.
Right. Well, it was funny because it was in the context of we were going to start a house church in Boise. We had just moved to Boise, and we found a few couples, and this one lady who was interested. We're having our first meeting in our living room. Like, this is our very first meeting, and we're kind of going around getting to know each other. And yeah, we're going around, and then that's when the lady said that, and I'm thinking, oh boy, if this lady is going to be a part of our house church, man, then every time we get together, she's pretty much just going to, like, it makes you paranoid too, because it's like, even if she doesn't say anything, you're thinking she can see right through me. She knows every secret sin that I have. And it's like, okay, we can't do that. That's not going to work. And so I think it was almost like the Holy Spirit kind of gave me that answer, was like, well, yeah, whatever you're looking for, you're probably going to find it. So why don't we look for Christ in one another, and then we'll see that. And if that's what we're seeing in one another, we can encourage that rather than focusing on our sins. Because, like, what good is that?
See, I thought you were going to say the Holy Spirit told you to run, but
that was the other thought. But I was like, I was already in my own house, so I couldn't go anywhere.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, so basically, this story, one of the greatest stories ever written. We have to look first at the very first sentence, which you've already mentioned, and people in a small loser little town died with an infrequency that was really annoying. Okay, fiction is pretty wild. Stories. If a story isn't well told, you say, I don't want to hear this. I'm going to walk away, right? And the starting of a story is a lot like an invitation, contract, and a seduction. Like in the story, The Lady with the Dog by Chekov, there's a guy named Gurov who sees a married lady that he wants to bang. So he starts playing with the lady's dog to become friends with the dog. And then the lady says, it's okay, you can give him a bone. And then he gives the dog a bone. And that's the invitation to continue the seduction.
Right.
And likewise, in the same way, Chekov invites you to a seduction, and you either give him a bone and let him keep going, right?
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to think about a story as an invitation to this seduction. And famously, the first line in the book, 1984, says, all the clocks in London were striking 13.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if this isn't your bag, you would throw the book across the room and say, bah, clocks don't strike 13. This is balderdash. Right?
He got it wrong. He made a mistake on the first line. What's wrong with this guy?
Dummy. But, it's like when you ask a girl out, she either says yes or no, or else she says, ooh, I don't know, tell me more. Right? So you can respond to Orwell's seduction by saying, I'm curious. Maybe I'll read another sentence, another sentence.
Yeah.
Right. So you go on with the seduction and keep on trucking. And what's wild is that clock striking 13 tells you something's wrong. He also says all the clocks in London were striking 13. So this disorder is really pervasive.
Right. So yeah, that actually is an important detail, because if it just says the clock was striking 13, you think, oh, that clock is jacked up. but it's
Right.
not that clock, it's every clock. Every clock is in lockstep together, synchronized to strike 13 together,
Right.
which creates this feeling of like, this idea that, there is a sort of tyrannical dictatorship, this
Right.
control, this society wants you to believe ridiculous things, right? Which again, that is really setting the tone for the whole book.
It means the aberration is not local; it's universalized and normal.
Yes.
And it calls into credibility the narrator, the story, the world, and as such, the first sentence by Orwell alerts the reader that in this fictional society, all statements of truth have to be questioned.
Yeah,
You can't trust anything.
that's right.
And all truth claims are suspect because of where they're coming from, what the secret agenda of the deliverer is. And guess what? That's the book.
Yeah.
That's what the book is about.
Yes.
So the whole book is in a germ form in the first sentence.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what's genius about that. I really love that. It also reminds me of when you talk about first lines like that. I always remember also the first line of Neuromancer by William Gibson is the line about the sky was the color of a television tuned to a dead channel.
Right.
Oh, damn, what a great first line. I mean, I read that first line and I was like, I'm hooked. I got to keep reading.
Yeah, and it's so funny because anybody who reads William Gibson has spent too much of their life on Earth watching TV.
Right.
So they get it, but also it has the shock of recognition.
Yeah.
Where as soon as you read that in 1984, when it came out, you're like, this is a book that's for me, right? It's not your grandpa's book, right? So yeah, that was a big coup. So also the thing about the opening sentence, when it says death was really annoying, whose point of view is that, right?
Yeah, of course it's his. It's Yakov's.
Right, right. But the funny thing is, when Chekhov is writing, it sounds like it's an objective, removed Joe Friday, Dragnet, just the facts man kind of omniscient, objective point of view. But the narrator here isn't afraid to get inside Bronze's head and like give you his take on things directly.
Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, what's interesting about that, I want to say, I think when you're writing a story, you have a choice. You can write it in first person. So I'm Yakov and this is what I'm doing this morning and this is what I think in my head. You can write it in third person, which is this is written more in a third person, like I'm removed and I'm telling you what's happening and I'm giving you, sometimes I can give you what this person's thinking along with the dialogue, but I'm an omniscient sort of person, right? And what's fascinating about the way Chekhov writes that story is he's kind of doing both, right?
Yes.
He gets to do both. He writes it as if he's this separate person, telling you what's happening, but he's telling it in a way that it feels like a first person, right? Because the way he speaks as the storyteller is what Yakov is thinking, is what he would say if he was telling his own story. So you're getting a little bit of a hint of the world as Yakov sees it, even as you're, reading the story. And that's actually really fascinating. And I don't think that's not a very common thing. I don't think I've often read stories that do that, but that's really good.
Yeah, it's like absolute genius. And of course, 10 years before, Dostoevsky had written Notes from the Underground, where in Notes from the Underground, the first line is, I'm a sick man, I'm an unhappy man, I'm a poor man, I think there's something wrong with my liver. So you're like, okay. So that book is relentlessly first person subjective, a guy just like bearing his thoughts to you, right? And then you're like, it's like being trapped in an elevator with like the speed freak where you're like, I think this is my floor. Can I get out? Right. And then
that's great.
So Chekhov wrote really clearly in letters to his brother about his strategy, about how if you really want to break someone's heart, you don't lay it on thick. But when the more tragic it gets, if your reportage goes more and more flat, that's when it actually works. And also, like, for example, here, there are details where you could get close to sentimentality if he didn't immediately change gears. And the way he has this very specific equilibrium between the ridiculous and the tragic, that really makes it work. So it feels like an objective story, but somehow the narrator is right inside Bronze's head and getting his actual sensations, which of course creative writing 101 would tell you that's against the rules, but whatever, right? Also, in the seduction of the first line, it's a seduction, it's an invitation, it's a flirtation, and it's also kind of a deception, where one of the most pleasing sensations is reading a book and finding out you've been tricked.
Yeah.
And oh wow, I thought I was getting a story about a cowboy, but really it's a story about, you know, fathers and sons or the meaning of life or something, right?
Right.
That's when art really works, when it has these things buried in it, right?
Yeah.
And actually, in the first line of the story, it's actually a time bomb where this story doesn't work unless you've read it 3 times. And the things you pointed out about Bronze's greed and things like that, there's actually a skeleton key in the opening that allows you to translate that and get under the hood, which I'll get back to in a bit. The story is called Rothschild's Fiddle. Okay. The funny thing is, the story is not about the famous Rothschild, who's a billionaire. Rothschild is not the protagonist. He's a minor character, and the story doesn't become, and the fiddle doesn't become Rothschild's fiddle until the story is over.
Right.
So, so I read the story and say, oh wow, the famous Rothschild is rich. This guy's poor. He doesn't have a fiddle. Once Bronze dies, he gets the fiddle, and his fortunes improve, and he gets a lot of money, like the real Rothschild, from the fiddle. After the smoke is cleared and the story is over. But then it's like, wait a minute, Rothschild's fiddle. Again, you have to reassess everything and go back again.
Right.
See.
Well, can I say something about that?
Sure.
Because I kind of missed that part. That's sort of a little one of the lower layers, maybe hidden layers of the story, because it's I guess you could think of it as people, those that get rich off of this, off of the loss and the suffering of others, right? So Rothschild didn't sort of receive his fame or make his fortune until this sad sack died and gave him the fiddle. So like, I mean, I don't know if that's an intended sort of a message, underlying message to the story, but yeah, that seems like that could be one of the things it's trying to say.
It was kind of funny how people notice, hey, Braun seems like a really greedy guy. And what's funny about that is like, people like to say they're against greed, but it's always someone else's greed that appalls them. Like people like to point out, wow, Jeff Bezos, that guy's pretty greedy, right? He went in, right? He went in outer space instead of giving that money to the Salvation Army. He's so greedy, right? And it's like, well, wait a minute, like I'm greedy, but I'm just not very good at it, right? Right? Like I'm not successful, right?
Right. So
like,
here's a great point about that, right? So somebody else, so let's say someone who's like homeless could look at me and say, like, maybe I'm driving a brand new car or something, right? I just bought a Toyota. And in my mind, I'm thinking, well, it's not an expensive car. I didn't buy a Ferrari. I just bought a Toyota, right? But the homeless guy looks at me and says, you bastard, how dare you? You look at you, you've got your job, you got your house, and oh, great, you just bought a car, but you could have given that money instead, right, to the Salvation Army or to me, right? And so everybody could, in somebody else's eyes, be that guy who's greedy because look what you did with your money. How dare you buy something for yourself when you could have done it right? You could have cared about the poor more.
Absolutely, for sure. And I'll have more to say on that in a minute. But just man, it's so great about how you see a story called Rothschild's Fiddle, so you think you're going to hear a story about Rothschild and his fiddle,
right?
Right? And the story's not about Rothschild. It's not about a fiddle, and uh, people die with an infrequency that's really annoying and all this stuff. And once you figure that out and say, okay, so Rothschild what? Um, again, this is Chekhov planting his flag in the sand and saying, here's the deal, take it or leave it.
Yeah.
And it's a very masterful way of saying, I'm the man, my story, I'm telling it my way. And it's really thrilling. You'll notice that warmth is mixed with cold. Uh, there is humor mixed with tragedy, surprise, just like life.
Yeah.
Just like your own day. Um, and it's very human. And the truth that these characters, unwittingly embody, points again how heartbreaking and ridiculous our own lives are, and it's just really like unparalleled, right?
Yeah.
Now, this is something like, and there are some things that only emerge like time bombs after you read the story 3 times.
Uh-huh.
Like, for example, early on, we find out that Bronze hates wasting his time on children's coffins because they don't make him a lot of money. So is this a good use of my time? Is it a financial loss?
Right.
And actually, the misdirection in the title and in the first line kind of, and Chekhov's narrative stance of misdirection should give us a clue that to read this story, we actually have to work as a translator. So it turns out Bronze's hatred of making children's coffins is not because of greed. It seems that way if you read the story once, but it's actually due to the pain of the child he lost 50 years ago.
So yeah, in a way, yeah, I kind of caught that. It's almost like the reason he hates making children's coffins is probably more of the fact that it reminds him that the first child's coffin he probably ever made was his own child's coffin.
Right. And it's like, yeah, if you read the story at first, like, wow, this guy's a real douchebag, right? and what if the reason a person and you've encountered a douchebag this week, right? What if the reason he's a douchebag is because of pain?
Right.
Right. So basically, Bronze is a douchebag because he hardened his heart to block out the pain.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that is true. I think that's probably exactly what it is. This is what twists him to become such a bitter person who decides to make a book about, like, he's experienced such a great loss. He starts to make a book counting, like he's convinced now that this is my life. My life is just all about loss. And I'm just going to add it up and open the book and count it up, Yeah.
Yeah, and it's funny, Chekhov started his career writing just straight comedy bits. And there are bits in here when he's tallying up his wins and losses. That's quite funny. And you're about to start laughing, but then Chekhov will change gears and get all serious. And it's just masterful how he does it, right? But basically, the contempt for child's coffins is a code for the pain of the child he lost.
Yes.
And the physical revulsion he feels for Rothschild's flute playing is a defense against opening old wounds and being reminded of funeral music.
Yeah.
Okay. And also, Bronze's hatred of Jews. It's not about Jews. This is actually really wild. Bronze didn't have a lot of luck in life, right? He didn't have a lot of insulation from the shocks of 1,000 mortal shocks that flesh is heir to. His hatred of Jews is a code. It's actually a dark mirror. Because when he sees Jews, he recognizes his solidarity with them as outsiders and as people who suffer. Okay.
Yeah.
So here's a riddle. Why is it that middle class people and lower class middle hate homeless people? They hate them so much because it reminds us of our own precariousness.
Right. In other words, we're one missed paycheck away from joining them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Seriously, because when you see a homeless person, it's a really dark mirror that forces you to think about all these things you don't want to think about.
Right. Yeah.
So,
It's touching on, yeah, this fear, this sort of unconscious fear that we have, subconscious fear that we have, that we could be there too. Right. And so we want to distance ourselves from them. We're not like them. Because what we're trying to do is convince ourselves that we're not like them and we're not ever going to be like them. Right. It's sort of like a mechanism for dealing with this inner struggle and fear that we have.
right. And that's one thing you have to think about to properly understand the story. And once you think about what you just said, you go back to Yakov, to Bronze in his shed with his book, tallying up his kopecks and all that stuff. And you go, wow, this isn't just slapstick about a douchebag. His obsessive tallying of losses, again, it's a code for the only way he has, the only tools of expression he has. It's a lamentation over his own life and for the human condition.
Right.
So the initial greed and vulgarity in Bronze, that's the first thing you notice, is actually an onion skin shell that has to be peeled back to get at the pearl of truth behind it.
Yeah.
Which might be true for that douchebag that you know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is also which is really fascinating. I mean, I think for somebody who's if you're a writer, I think the tendency would be, so like, let's say the creative writing assignment was, I want you to write a story about an old guy whose child died and he's really sad and he's really bitter. And this is the source of his pain and suffering. The problem is most people would do that. They would just write a story. Here's this guy, and look at him. His child died. Look how sad he is. And the thing is, that's not a story, and it's so obvious. It's like, so what? And what's beautiful about someone like Chekov is the ability to tell you that story, but in a way, they tell you that story by not telling you that story. And
Absolutely.
I think that's the genius. I mean, I when I was young, because I am a writer and I'm fascinated by these things. Like when I started writing poetry and when I was in high school, I kind of felt like that was sort of my sort of whatever personal definition of how to write poetry. Like I felt like when I was writing poetry, I was doing the same thing. I'm trying to communicate something, but without saying it. I don't want to come out and say it, but at the same time, I want you, when you finish reading it, it's almost like Inception. I'm planting a thought in your head or a feeling in your head, but I'm going to do it without just outright saying the thing, because then that's not interesting and that's not poetry and that's not art. So there is a little bit of a dance that goes on where you're in an indirect way trying to communicate something really deep and really true and really, human, but to do it in a way creatively that isn't so obvious. It's like, it's not obvious what you're doing. It's in a way, it's almost like it's kind of similar to like doing a magic trick, right?
Very much so, yeah.
You can't see what I'm doing. You can't see what I'm palming. You can't see the hidden compartment or when I misdirect you or whatever. Like if you see that, the magic trick is blown. But if you do it in the right way, when you're done at the end, people are like, wow, that was great. And I can't see how you did it. I'm not really sure. Like you'd have to dig down deep like we're doing with this Chekov story and go, wow, look at all these clues and all these little threads and all these little things that are suggestions. They don't seem to be the point of the story as you're reading the story. But it's only after you go back and then look at it again that you recognize, wow, that was a super important detail. Or, oh, okay, wait, there's something else going on here. But he doesn't spend a lot of time on it. He's not like there's no flashing neon sign over, hey, everybody, look at this. You just kind of pick up on these things. And honestly, I love that kind of stuff. This is why I love poetry and fiction and literature and things like this. But it's also what makes it so difficult to do it well. Like I've been writing books. I'm just finishing up a 7-part series of books, and they're nonfiction kind of books about theology and things like that. And I figured that out. Like I churned out 7 books in 5 years because I kind of figured out how to do that. I know how to do that really well, and I can do it. But I would love to get back to writing fiction one day, and I've got one in the back of my mind. I've got a plan. Like I want to be able to sit down and write, some fiction again. But frankly, it's exactly this what we're talking about that intimidates me, because it's so hard. It's so hard to do it and to do it well. And I don't want to do it unless I can do it well. And I don't want to do it unless, like, I want people to read. If I write a piece of fiction, I want them to put it down and say, damn, that was amazing. How did he do that? Right. And it's just not knowing. I feel like I've done that in the past. When I was in high school and college, I did that. I did primarily, that's all I did, was I wrote fiction and poetry and stuff. And it's a different muscle. You know what I mean? Creatively, it's a different muscle. And I haven't flexed that muscle in a long time. So having to go back almost from the beginning and like, oh, now I'm going to approach this again. I'm going to try and write fiction again. Yeah, it's a bit intimidating. It's not an easy thing to do. It takes a whole lot of, I have to kind of get in the zone to do that. And it used to be I could get in that zone a lot easier. And I haven't been in that zone in so long. I'm not sure I can get back in.
Wow. Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder. Like I always wrote all these different kinds of things, and then I guess I'd published 3 books of poetry when I wrote a poem that had 24 lines, and I just liked the way it looked. And I thought, what if I did a series of X number of poems with 24 lines? What if, right?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what I've been doing. And I just kind of like it. And it's not like it makes things easier or it's like autopilot, but it was just an interesting formal restriction to put on myself.
Yeah.
Where I'd be like, oh wow, I'm at line 16, the finish line is approaching.
Yeah.
I'd better sculpt and be concise.
Prepare for landing. You got to put the wheels down and get ready for landing. Yeah.
And I did kind of go to poetry because I was kind of dissatisfied a little bit with my fiction, in the sense that poetry forces you to be concise, because if you're not, it just smells wrong and everyone can tell.
Yeah.
So I just find that really rewarding. But certainly this story is a real tribute to the power of art and what art can do, that that it can do things that can't be done in any other way, right?
Right.
Like if you read Anton Chekov, it makes you want to be a better person, and it makes you want to love your neighbor.
Yeah.
But if you go to church and the priest tells you a sermon saying, be nice, right? If I'm sitting there, I just start daydreaming, thinking about ladies, thinking about the bench, how uncomfortable it is. And it just doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
But great art has all these like rewards for your digging and for your attention, where the more you give to Rothschild's Fiddle, the more it will give back to you.
Yeah.
And it does make you a better person. So that's really inspiring.
Yeah.
Also, it's kind of funny how in Samuel, when David first appears, Saul is being plagued by demons, and David will play notes on a stringed instrument to soothe him. And this story, Bronze, is both Saul and David, where when he's beset by demons, he plucks at his strings to soothe his soul. So he's both David and Saul.
Yes.
So basically now, you can kind of zoom out and then zoom back in for a minute. Basically, Chekhov's great innovation, his thing that changed the world, was shattering the barrier between comedy and tragedy. And William Shakespeare, he had hinted at this in The Tempest, where it starts off, it has all these clues, letting the audience know it's a tragedy.
Right.
Like we said before, when they have an away team on Star Trek, the guy with the red shirt you've never seen before,
He's going to
he's
die
going to
in the
get
first 10
eaten.
minutes. Yeah.
Yeah. So at the start of The Tempest, there's all these clues saying, okay, this is a tragedy. And in Shakespeare's tragedy, everyone dies at the end. And in Shakespeare's comedy, everyone gets married at the end. So, there's a guy who's been wronged. He spent 30 years plotting his revenge. Now he's springing his trap. So it's going to go. And the big last moment, the guy says, oh, actually, I choose Christian forgiveness instead. Let's have a wedding. It's like, what? And it was, and like I've said before, The Tempest is the play where Shakespeare lets you know that he knows just how good he is.
Right.
And he's kind of going for a victory lap and breaking all these rules.
Yeah.
And getting away with it. Basically, and then Chekov comes along. Basically, the question Anton Chekov asks is, what if the gravedigger was Hamlet? Okay. What if the gravedigger was Hamlet? Check out this. So Hamlet's out. So Shakespeare was a big step forward in human evolution. And there was a scholar named Harold Bloom who was a bit of a blowhard, but he wrote a book about Shakespeare called The Invention of the Human, which is a pretty ballsy claim, and which he kind of overstated. But he's basically saying, before Shakespeare, this whole idea we have about the individual, the introspective guy, asking about meaning in life, and right, we think that's all normal, but it's actually Shakespearean. This whole idea about giving rein and expression to these thoughts, which you couldn't verbalize before Shakespeare because we literally didn't have the words for them.
Right.
That was a huge step forward, and you can't have an idea before you have the words for that idea. Right? So that was a big step forward. So in Hamlet's walking, he sees a gravedigger, and the gravedigger has deep thoughts about, oh wow. I'm here digging these graves, and I notice kings die, poor people, just like poor people do. And a king, his body decomposes, gets turned into dirt, that becomes a tree, and then that tree is used to make cork for a wine bottle. And wow, right? Isn't that wild? So then you hear this stuff that the gravedigger's saying, and it sounds really profound. And then you wonder, wait, is this profound or is it corny? Right? He's basically saying, gee, everyone dies, nobody lives forever, right? And it's like, is that profound or corny? And it turns out it's so artfully delivered. You're like, who cares? It's right. And that's part of the fun, where like there are love songs that are corny and love songs that are universal, right? On the one hand, it doesn't matter. What matters is how well it's done, right? The Undertaker has all these interesting thoughts about, wow, kings are big shots compared to me, but I notice they die too. That's interesting. Yeah. Well, see you later. I'll just leave you with that. And then he disappears. What's happening there is that he knows his place in the sense that the gravedigger, he could have profound thoughts, but he couldn't make the plot happen.
Right.
Okay. He wasn't allowed to have his own story or have his own free agency.
Right.
And he wasn't allowed to say to be or not to be. What's the meaning of life? Because he's only a gravedigger. Come on.
Right.
And Hamlet, he's a nobly born. So that's his stuff. So you can see the Undertaker trying, but smacking up against the reality of Shakespeare's hierarchical universe.
Right.
Like that's not how it works. Then the world has to hold its breath for 300 years until Anton Chekov comes along and says, what if an Undertaker was as fully alive and fully human as a prince? So 300 years later, Chekhov says, I know a guy named Bronze, and you're probably not going to like him very much. And his IQ was sub-average, and he wasn't very good looking, and he never got his name in the paper or in People magazine. But I dare to say to you that he is just as holy as a king, and his interior life is just as rich and just as worthy of study as Napoleon.
Mm-hmm.
And this person who you ignore and who seems like a low class menial whatever is just as endlessly valuable as royalty.
Yeah.
And that's an action. And like we say we believe in equality, but we don't, whatever, right? But so we say, okay, okay, great, but it's actually an incendiary, revolutionary claim. So you go, oh wow, and this is something that actually never happened before, and it was actually considered ugly or unseemly, like like flashing yourself or like exposing yourself in public or something, because the whole point of because society said classy people had their portraits painted. Grave diggers and coffin makers and garlic farmers and Jews didn't get their portraits painted.
Yeah.
That's the basis of our society.
Yeah.
And it works really well, right? So the idea of painting a portrait of a Jew or a coffin maker was actually very incendiary, very scandalous, literally.
Wow.
And actually, Tolstoy took Chekhov to task for that a bit. And they had a lot of arguments about that, where I guess we'll save that for later, but Tolstoy said he loved the peasants. But when he would write about them, they were these idealized, noble, savage types, because he only ever saw peasants out the window, right? And then Chekhov had a great short story called Peasants, in which he showed peasants fighting, stealing, getting hammered, punching, doing things people do. And then Tolstoy said, "Oh, that's not helping my cause of social reform. You should have idealized them and showed right." So basically, Chekhov shows them as acting like humans, and Tolstoy's like, "No, no, no, don't show those rough edges. I'm trying to change the world here." And Chekhov's like, "No, I say they're human beings, not your puppets." So basically, Chekhov spending this amount of love and care and superhuman Shakespeare level skill on Bronze, who at your first glance, you'd say, he's just a douchebag. I don't care. Right? Then Shakespeare makes you spin around and come back and go, no, 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 there's more going on here. Until you love Bronze.
Yeah. You mean Chekhov does that, not Shakespeare?
Chekhov. Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So if I say to you, do you want to read, on paper, if I said, hey, you can watch Star Wars tonight, or you can learn about Bronze, on paper, you'd be like, oh man, I don't want to know about this guy.
Yeah.
Right. He was a bad husband, to say the least. He's an idiot. You're not really selling me here, right?
Right.
But through the power of art, Chekhov spins you around.
Yeah.
And what's funny again is that this is how Chekhov makes you a better person. Once he's sold you on that, where you're like, wow, Chekhov, you were right. I was wrong about Bronze. I love Bronze. He's awesome. Actually, this project kind of indicts and points a finger at you, the reader. And once you realize the actual strategy here, which happens when you've read the story 3 times, whatever, Chekhov is actually saying to you, you screwed up. Do you remember that woman that you passed by and you ignored her to the point where you turned her invisible because you didn't find her sexually attractive? She seemed kind of fat and stupid. She never made a big splash in life, never did anything notable or remarkable, and now you didn't even remember her. That person who you treated like worthless and with your lack of care made her turn invisible, that person was infinitely valuable
Yeah.
and worth infinite dignity, infinite complex, and endlessly valuable.
Yeah, that is beautiful. And that, yeah, that is right. I think that's really what's happening in the story. Yeah. Because at first glance, yeah, our reaction to Yakov is sort of like rejection, revulsion, and like, what a jerk. I don't want to be, I wouldn't want to hang out with that guy. I wouldn't invite him to my house for dinner. And like, I really don't like this guy. But then, yeah, then you reach this point where you kind of see beneath his pain, you understand what his sort of, what in his life has brought him to this point. And you have compassion on him. Like you said, you finally realize, oh, wow, you know what? He's not a nice person. He has a lot of horrible qualities, but I understand it and I get it. And you have compassion with this person, but it is then this mirror now reflecting back to us of because we do this to people all the time, like you said, right?
Totally.
We do this to people all the time. We have this very surface level reaction to someone. I don't like their attitude. I think they're dumb. Or they're whatever. You find something about them you don't like, and see, in a way, okay, here we go. In a way, we're also then looking at other people with a filter, right? We have this filter on, and if they're not attractive, they're not like me, I think, right? But ultimately, it's like, yeah, I'm looking for all the ways you're not like me. Okay, you know what? I don't like you. I don't want to spend time on you. The same thing, right? Because Yakov has his filter, and we see again, it's this thing too, like where, and you can do this much easier, I think, in a story, right? We as human beings are really good at picking out the flaws in other people, but when it comes to ourselves, we have sort of a blind spot, right? I don't focus on my weaknesses and my problems and my,
Sure.
yeah, I focus on the positive things. But on you, man, I see you're kind of this
It's
or
obvious.
that, right? It's so obvious. How can you not know, right? The same
Yeah,
way
yeah.
I don't notice, right?
Get with
So
it, yeah.
the story allows us to it does kind of trick you, right? Next thing you know, it's sort of like as you're reading the story, it becomes like the book, because the story becomes like a mirror where it slowly turns back around to you.
Absolutely.
And then you're like, oh, damn. Yep.
And that's one of the greatest pleasures of literature, that pleasant sensation of realizing you've been tricked, you've been taken for a ride.
Yeah.
And that, oh, this story isn't about X, it's about something else, right? And like you say, this story does remind you that, isn't it interesting? We give ourselves all these kinds of breaks that we don't give to other people.
Right.
Like, you know how you've said to people, oh, I'm sorry I was rude to you yesterday, but you have to understand, I had a lot on my plate, I was in a bad mood.
Right.
So, right? But you never do that for other people, right? So it's like, oh wow, Bronze, what a jerk. He wasted his whole life on Earth, focusing on resentment and bitterness.
Yeah.
And with his dying breath, he gets some redemption by giving his fiddle to Rothschild, so the story can have a title. But then you realize, wow, he did that because he was in pain.
Yeah.
Right. Maybe I should shut up.
Right.
Maybe I'm just not qualified to judge.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, that's really good. Well, this was a great story, man. I really appreciate it. I love the opportunity to kind of spend time reading a story and talking about it and pulling these things out. So this has been really great. Hopefully we'll do another story time down the road.
Great.
Yeah, good stuff. All right, man. Well, thanks a lot.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. And thank you all for listening. We'll see you again next time.
Yes. Thank you very much.